For 3 months, the people searching for Helen Bailey kept coming back to the same man, the fiancé. He answered the police questions. He spoke to her frightened friends. He let the volunteers walk the lanes around the house and call her name into the hedgerows. And the whole time, he was the one person in that search who never once had to wonder where she was. He already knew. She was in the sewage tank beneath the garage where he slept every night. And he was the one who had put her there. That is not the part that should frighten you. The part that should frighten you is how she came to trust him at all. Because the door he walked through to reach her was opened by the worst thing that had ever happened to her. And the grief he used to get inside her life was covering for a second body that nobody had thought to look for. Helen Bailey was a writer, and not a struggling one. By the time most people heard her name beside the word murder, she had already published more than 20 books, most of them for children and teenagers. One series in particular, the Electra Brown novels, had a devoted following among girls who saw themselves in a sharp, funny, slightly chaotic narrator trying to hold her life together while it quietly came apart at the seams. Helen was good at that voice. She was good at writing a person who keeps smiling through the cracks. It is a cruel thing, in hindsight, for her to have been so good at. There is a small detail from her early life that sits oddly against everything that happened to her. As a young woman, she studied physiology, and for a while, she intended to become a forensic scientist, the kind of person who reads a body for the truth of how it died. She changed direction and went into publishing instead. She and her first husband, John Sinfield, built a successful character licensing business together in London, handling some of the most famous names a child would recognize, and later she helped launch a publishing phenomenon of her own. They were together 22 years and married for 15 of them. By every account that survives her, it was a good marriage, a whole, settled, unremarkable life, the kind whose value you only see clearly once it has been taken away. It was taken away in a single morning. In February 2011, Helen and John were on holiday in Barbados. He went into the sea to swim, and a rip current took him, and Helen watched it happen from the sand, close enough to see and far too far to reach. There was nothing she or anyone else on that beach could do. She had gone down to breakfast that day a wife. By the time the sun was overhead, she was a widow, 3,500 miles from home, holding the rest of her life in her hands, and not knowing what she was supposed to do with it. What she did with it was right. A few months after John drowned, Helen started a blog and called it Planet Grief. It was never meant to be read by anyone. It was a private place to put the specific, unbearable, faintly ridiculous details of mourning that nobody warns you about. Buying a single Scotch egg in a shop because there was no longer anyone to buy the second one for. Crying while dragging a rubbish bin to the curb. The way the smallest domestic nothing could ambush her in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. She wrote it the way she wrote everything, with honesty and a very dark sense of humor. And slowly it stopped being private. Other widows found it. Then people who had lost anyone at all. With a year, she had a worldwide readership of the bereaved, thousands of strangers who came to her because she had found language for the thing that had taken theirs. She turned it into a memoir. The dog in the title, Boris, a miniature dachshund, was the small, warm body that had kept her alive through the worst of it. Remember Boris. He is going to matter more than a dog should be allowed to matter in a story like this one. So understand who Helen Bailey was before any of the rest of it. She was not naive. She was a woman who had looked directly at the worst day of her life and then built something out of the wreckage that helped people she would never meet. She had turned her own grief into a kind of public service, a lighthouse for other people lost in the same fog. And that, exactly that, was the door standing open when Ian Stewart walked up to it. They connected in the autumn of 2011, only months after John's death, through an online community for the bereaved. That single fact is the whole case, so stay with it for a moment. Helen did not meet Ian Stewart at a party, or through old friends, or across a desk at work. She met him inside a room that existed specifically for grieving people, a place whose entire reason for being was that everyone inside it had been hurt in the same way, and could therefore finally be trusted. He presented as one of them, a widower, a quiet, unthreatening man, a former software engineer who no longer worked because of a muscle-weakening condition called myasthenia gravis, a father of 2 grown sons, a man who, like her, had lost the person he was meant to grow old beside. They shared the one thing that feels, to someone in mourning, like the only thing that could possibly matter. He understood. Of course he understood. He had been there too. There is a documented name for what this is, and forensic psychologists handle it carefully, because it sits underneath so many crimes that look, from the outside, like nothing more than love gone wrong. It is the exploitation of vulnerability through affinity. Predators do not always break a person's defenses down. Sometimes they are let in through them, because they arrive holding the one credential the victim is least able to question. A shared wound is a master key. It walks straight past every instinct a person has for measuring a stranger, because the man in front of you is not a stranger. He is a fellow survivor. Helen had spent 2 years learning to trust the people who found their way to Planet Grief. Ian Stewart found his way to her the same way they did. By the time you would normally begin asking the careful questions about a new partner, she had already answered the only question that counted. He knew what it was to lose someone. She had seen the proof of it. She had no way of knowing the proof was something he had built with his own hands. This is not a rare trick, and that is the hardest part of it to sit with. The people who study fraud and predatory relationships have understood for a long time that the recently bereaved are not chosen at random. They are sought out. A person in fresh grief is, in measurable ways, an easier mark. Their judgment is clouded by exhaustion and loneliness. Their ordinary wariness has been overwhelmed by a need for comfort that feels more urgent than caution ever could. They are often, suddenly, in sole control of money they never expected to handle alone, a dead spouse's savings, an insurance payout, a house, and they have just learned, in the most brutal way, that they could not protect the person they loved most from being taken, which makes the arrival of someone who seems to understand feel less like luck and more like rescue. Predators read all of this fluently. The grief support group, the widow's coffee morning, the comment thread under a blog like Planet Grief are not safe spaces to a man like Ian Stewart. They are stocked ponds, full of people pre-selected for vulnerability, who have been gently taught by the very nature of the place not to question anyone who carries the same wound. Helen had built one of those rooms with her own words. She had filled it with comfort for strangers, and she could not have imagined that the architecture of kindness she raised was the exact structure a predator needed to walk through without being seen. They moved in together into a large house in Royston, in Hertfordshire, worth around £1.5 million, with a garden and outbuildings and an old well under the garage floor that fed down into a sewage tank. They got engaged. They began planning a wedding for the spring of 2016. To the people who loved Helen, she had done the quiet, hope-for thing that you secretly wish for a widow. She had survived her loss and found someone safe to be loved by again. Her mother liked to believe it. Her friends wanted to believe it. From the outside, the relationship looked like the soft landing at the end of a tragedy. There is one moment from inside that house you need to carry with you, because it comes back at the very end, and it will not feel the same when it does. In August 2013, Helen's brother John visited the Royston home for the first and only time. Helen gave him the tour, proud of the place, the garden, the outbuildings, the garage. Somebody pointed out the old well beneath the garage floor. And Helen, who was witty the way her books were witty, made a joke. She said it would be a good place to hide a body. Her fiancé was standing right there when she said it. He heard every word of it. 3 years before she vanished, the woman herself named the exact spot, out loud, in front of the exact man. Nobody thought about it again. Why would they? It was a joke in a happy house. Hold on to it anyway. Because somewhere in the months before that spring wedding, the thing that was wrong with Helen Bailey stopped being grief and became chemistry. Her mother, Eileen, who was in her late 80s, started to feel uneasy. Not about the relationship in the abstract, about her daughter. Helen was becoming forgetful in a way she simply never had been. There was the day at the supermarket when she walked back to her car, still holding the handheld scanner from inside the shop, with no memory of having taken it. There was the day she lost the dog on the beach and, instead of searching, she just gave up and went home, which the Helen her family knew would never have done. She was sleeping in the daytime. She telephoned her mother once, in a kind of bewildered panic, to say she had slept for hours in the middle of the day. She said a full night's rest had not been enough. She said that she would sit at her own computer and look down and not recognize her own hands on the keys. She had even started worrying about dizziness, had bought herself 3 new pairs of glasses trying to fix a problem that was not in her eyes. Eileen, like any mother, reached for the ordinary explanations. The menopause, stress, tiredness, new glasses. She reassured her daughter and let it go. And she would later sit in a courtroom, 88 years old, and weep over how easy it had been to be reassured. She kept saying a version of the same thing. I was dismissive. I didn't think it was a big deal. It was just another memory problem. A mother forgiving herself in public for not having imagined the unimaginable. What was happening to Helen Bailey was not in her mind, and it was not in her age. It was in her food, or her tea, or her wine. Ian Stewart had a prescription for a sleeping drug called Zopiclone for his own insomnia. And in the weeks and months before she disappeared, that same drug was finding its way into Helen's body. Investigators would later establish it through analysis of her hair, which keeps a record over time the way the rings of a tree do. The drug had not been taken once. It had been taken on more than one occasion, across a stretch of time. Someone had been sedating her, quietly, repeatedly, watching her grow confused and exhausted and frightened by her own body, and saying nothing while she phoned her mother in tears, trying to work out what was wrong with her. This is the detail that separates this killing from most killings. And it is worth slowing all the way down for, because it tells you precisely what kind of mind you are looking at. Most homicide is hot. It is reactive. It happens in a single burst of rage or fear or panic in seconds. And the person who did it often barely understands what they have done until it is already over. Forensic psychology draws a hard line between that and another kind of violence entirely. The cold kind, instrumental violence, predatory violence, not an explosion, but a plan, executed in stages, by someone calm enough to live comfortably inside the lie for months, while the victim is still alive, still trusting him, still asking him to pass her the tea. Putting a sedative into the drink of a woman you intend to kill, again and again for weeks, is not the act of a man who snapped. It is the act of a man who is in no hurry at all. A man who has decided and who is willing to sit across the table and watch her suffer the early symptoms of her own murder, and comfort her about them, and refill the cup. The grief he had used to get in was a performance. The patience underneath it was the only honest thing about him. On the 11th of April, 2016, Helen Bailey was alive, We know that because that morning she was emailing her oldest friend, Tracy, about wedding dresses and the venue, excited, looking ahead, sounding like a woman with a future in front of her. There was nothing in those messages to hint that anything was wrong. By the end of that same day, Tracy could not reach her. The texts went unanswered, the calls rang out, and the silence that began on the 11th of April did not break for 3 months. Now watch what the man at the center of it did with that silence, because every single move is a tell. He did not call the police. Not that day, not the next. A woman vanishes from the home she shares with you, the woman you are about to marry, and you do nothing at all. When her friends and her family began to panic, Stewart had his explanation ready. Helen had needed some space, he said. She had gone away for a while. Later, the story would grow new limbs. He would claim that 2 men, one of them named Nick and the other Joe, were involved somehow, that they had some hold over her, that they had taken her and would bring her back. When the prosecution finally laid all of this in front of a jury, they used one blunt word for the Nick and Joe story: absurd. It was a story with no evidence behind it, and no function except to place some other person, anyone, at the scene of his fiancée's disappearance. He only reported her missing on the 15th of April, 4 days after the silence started. And he did it under pressure, because her family had reached the point of preparing to call the police themselves. And a man who appears to be doing nothing while his bride is missing begins to look like precisely what he is, so he reported it. The grieving fiancé, raising the alarm 4 days late about a woman who was already dead and already in the ground. Then he played the part. He let the searches happen. He spoke to the worried people. And those who watched him closely during the investigation would later say there was something off in how he behaved. When the police actually went through the house and the devices, something the prosecution described as unusual and strange, as though he had not expected the search to be quite so thorough. As though he had assumed certain things would never be looked at closely. It is worth holding his behavior up against what real grief actually looks like, because the contrast is its own kind of evidence. A person whose partner has genuinely vanished does not pace themselves. They do not wait 4 days. They are frantic on the first afternoon. They call everyone they can think of. They drive the routes she might have driven. They cannot eat, cannot sit still, cannot stop, because the not knowing is a physical agony and the imagination fills every silence with catastrophe. Ian Stewart felt none of that, because for him there was no not knowing. There was no silence to fill with dread. He knew the ending. He had written it himself. So what he had to produce in place of panic was the careful, rationed appearance of a worried man, handed out in the right amounts, at the right times, mostly when other people were pressing him to perform it. Forensic psychologists have a name for the quiet satisfaction some offenders take in exactly this, in deceiving the people closest to them, in accepting a community's sympathy for a law what they themselves engineered. It hides easily, because grief and guilt can look the same to an outsider, and a calm man at the center of a tragedy is usually assumed to be in shock. Stewart was not in shock. He was managing an audience. There is a question that haunts this stretch of the case, and the defense would lean on it hard. Stewart genuinely had myasthenia gravis, a real illness that genuinely weakens the muscles. How could this frail, sick man have carried a body, lifted a garage floor, lowered a grown woman and her dog into a tank in the ground? It is a fair question. It is also the wrong one, and the reason it is the wrong one is sitting in the very next thing he did. Because while everyone around him was busy asking whether Ian Stewart was physically strong enough to move Helen Bailey, Ian Stewart was at his computer moving her money. On the very afternoon Helen was killed, a standing order was changed. Money that had been moving in a small regular amount from Helen's account was redirected that same day in a far large sum, toward him. He had access to her bank accounts and her email, and he used all of it. While she was officially a missing person, while her face was on appeals and her friends were combing the lanes, the joint money kept quietly working in his favor. When an email arrived from Helen's beloved Arsenal, the football club whose matches she had attended faithfully for years as a season ticket holder, reminding her that the tickets were due to be renewed. The tickets were renewed. Both of them. More than £1,500 each, paid from the shared account. For a woman, the man paying knew would never sit in those seats again. He even went through the internet history and deleted it, scrubbing the record of what he had been doing, except that a single fragment of the data survived, the way these things do, and the police pulled it back out into the light. This is the first place the case turns hard, and it turns on the oldest and simplest of human appetites: greed. Helen Bailey was worth a great deal of money. Around £4 million between her own earnings, what John had left her, and the house they all lived in. Ian Stewart did not kill her in a rage. He killed her the way a person kills something to take what it has. Methodically, with the books left open on the desk, renewing the season tickets of a dead woman simply because the renewal date had come around and the money was, as far as he was concerned, already his to spend. But greed is a motive, not a proof. The thing that physically chained him to the lie came from a small, almost invisible direction. It came from her phone. Helen had a holiday home on the coast, in Broadstairs, the sort of place a person might go to get some space, which fit very neatly with the story Stewart was telling everyone. After he reported her missing, he went down to that coastal house. And while he was there, Helen Bailey's iPhone, the phone everyone agreed, she carried with her everywhere, quietly connected to the wireless network inside the holiday home. A phone reaching a router leaves a record. It says, in effect, this device was within these walls at this hour. But Helen was already dead, already folded into a tank 100 miles away. So the only person who could have carried that phone into the Broadstairs house, the only explanation for why her device reached out and touched that network, was that the man telling the whole world he had no idea where she was, had her phone in his pocket. He had her phone because he had taken it from her. He had it because she had not gone away to find peace. She was exactly where he had put her. And her phone was a loose thread he had forgotten to cut. The prosecutor called that connection a very significant event, and it was, because it did the one thing the money could not do on its own. It put the lie and the man inside the same room. Everything Ian Stewart said depended on Helen being out there somewhere, alive, unreachable, choosing on her own not to come home. The phone said otherwise. The phone said he had been holding a piece of her the entire time he stood there, claiming to search. For 3 months, though, none of it was enough to find her. The police suspected him almost from the beginning. Suspicion is not a body. They could not move forward without one, and the one place nobody had thought to look was the one place a happy woman had once joked about out loud. In the end, it came down to a neighbor. An elderly woman named Mavis Drake, who was in her 80s, lived nearby and, like a lot of people who have lived somewhere a long time, paid attention. She watched the world go by from a stool at her bedroom window. She noticed the comings and goings of the house next door, the ordinary rhythm of it, and the moments the rhythm broke. What she had seen and what she passed on helped turn the search inward, toward the property itself, toward the ground beneath the family's own feet. And in July 2016, 3 months after Helen Bailey wrote to her friend about wedding dresses, and then went silent, the police lifted the garage floor and opened the tank beneath it. She was inside. And curled in there with her, where he had been put as well, was Boris, even the dog. A vet who examined the little dachshund afterward could not even determine how he had died. Helen had been sedated. She had been suffocated. And then she had been lowered into the exact spot she had once stood and pointed at, and named as a good place to hide a body by the man who had been standing beside her when she said it. He had heard the joke. He had filed it away, and when the time came, he used it. In February 2017, at St. Albans Crown Court, a jury took the measure of Ian Stewart. They convicted him of murder. They also convicted him of preventing her lawful burial, of fraud, and of 3 separate counts of perverting the course of justice. The lies, the Nick and Joe story, the whole performance of the searching, hoping fiancé. The prosecution had a phrase for what he really was underneath all of it. A liar and an actor. They said Helen had been grossly deceived by a man who had been preying on her. The judge's words at sentencing made the shape of it plain. This was not passion. This was a long plan, carried out coldly, to take both the life and the fortune of a woman who had let him into the most fragile part of herself. That should be the end of it. A monstrous, complete, finished crime. For a few days, that is what everyone believed it was. And then the detectives who had spent a year living inside Ian Stewart's life did the thing good detectives do when a man turns out to have built his entire approach to a wealthy widow on a foundation of shared grief. They went back and asked a question that nobody in all those months had thought to ask. They asked about his first wife, because Ian Stewart had walked into Helen Bailey's life as a widower. That was the credential. That was the master key. He was a man who had lost his wife, and so he understood, and so he was safe. Her name was Diane. She was 47 years old. She had lived with epilepsy since she was a child, and she was the mother of his 2 sons, Jamie and Oliver. And in June 2010, more than a year before Ian Stewart ever sat and consoled Helen Bailey over the loss of John, Diane Stewart was found dead in the garden of the family home in Cambridgeshire. At the time, it looked like nothing. It looked like the saddest kind of ordinary. A woman with lifelong epilepsy, found collapsed in her own garden, and a conclusion that fit the facts as everyone then understood them. Sudden, unexpected death in epilepsy. There is even a clinical shorthand for it, because it happens often enough to need one. No suspicion fell on the quiet, frail husband. There was no earthly reason it should have. Diane was cremated, and that detail, the cremation, is going to matter in a way that will not let you sit comfortably, so mark it now. When the police reopened Diane's death after his conviction for Helen, they brought in a home office pathologist, and what he told the second court is one of the quietest and most chilling pieces of testimony in either case. Sudden, unexpected death in epilepsy, he explained, is not really a finding at all. It is the absence of one. It is the phrase written down when a person with epilepsy dies and nothing else can be proven. It is a diagnosis of exclusion, and the very same picture, a woman with epilepsy found dead with no clear cause, is equally consistent with something else entirely. With being smothered. With being put deliberately into a state she did not come back from. He pointed out, too, that if Diane had genuinely collapsed in a seizure onto the hard ground of that garden, you would expect to find certain injuries on her body. They were not there. This is the blind spot that men like Ian Stewart live inside. A violent death announces itself. A gunshot, a beating, a body folded into a tank. All of these force a system to respond. But a death dressed as illness asks almost nothing of anyone. There is a grieving family who do not want to start a fight over the body of someone they loved. There is a doctor who signs the expected form. There is a coroner working from the likeliest explanation. And there is a cause of death that was, in life, completely real. Diane did have epilepsy. The illness itself gave the lie its cover. People who study homicide have warned for decades that an unknown number of murders are never recorded as murders at all because they were staged to look like the ordinary ways human beings die. And because the people best placed to notice something wrong, the family, are usually the very people being deceived. The smarter the killer, the more his crime resembles nothing at all. Ian Stewart's first murder was nearly perfect, and not because it was clever, because it was quiet. It asked the world to believe something sad and ordinary, and the world, having no reason to do otherwise, believed it for almost 12 years. And then there was the funeral. A friend of Diane's would remember the way Ian Stewart had been at it. Not destroyed, not hollowed out, aloof, unbothered. A man moving through the motions of a grief he did not actually feel, in front of people who assumed the stiffness, was simply his way of coping. It was not his way of coping. There was nothing for him to cope with. He had ended her. In February 2022, a second jury, in a second courtroom, reached the same verdict the first one had, about a death that had been sitting quietly in the records as natural for nearly 12 years. They convicted Ian Stewart of the murder of Diane Stewart. When the police had come to take him from prison to question him about her, a camera caught his reaction in the back of the car. He swore. He called it rubbish. The man who had cried for the cameras over a fiancée he had drowned in sedatives could not even perform sorrow for the wife he had killed first. He was sentenced for a time to die in prison under a whole life order, before the Court of Appeal later adjusted it to a life sentence with a minimum of 35 years, on the narrow legal reasoning that the first murder, taken on its own, could not be treated as exceptional, since when he committed it, he was not yet known to be a man building a series. Now go back to the very beginning and feel it land. When Ian Stewart sat with Helen Bailey in those early tender days, and told her that he understood her loss because he had lost his wife too, when he offered her the one thing a grieving person cannot refuse, the recognition of a fellow survivor, he was grieving Diane. That was the bond. That was the proof Helen trusted with her whole broken heart. A widower's sorrow. And it was a complete fiction, because the wife he was mourning in order to win Helen was a woman he had murdered with his own hands. The grief that opened Helen Bailey's door was not even his to feel. He had killed for it. He had manufactured the exact wound he then carried into a community of the wounded, looking for the next woman with money and a hole in her life, the precise shape of him. The shared loss that felt to Helen like the safest possible reason on earth to trust a man was the single most dangerous thing about him, because he was the one who had made it. That is what this case leaves you holding. Not a tidy lesson, a pattern. The places we build to be safe, the rooms set aside for the hurt, the communities that exist precisely because everyone inside has already been broken the same way. All run on a kind of trust that never gets tested, because testing it would feel obscene. You do not interrogate a fellow mourner. You do not demand that a grieving man prove his grief is real. And a particular kind of predator understands that far better than the people who built the room ever will. He does not pick the lock on your defenses. He waits for the day life smashes them open from the inside, and then he walks in through the wreckage, holding up a wound that matches yours. Helen Bailey looked at the worst day of her life and turned it into something that helped thousands of strangers carry theirs. The cruelty at the center of this is not only that she was killed, it is that she was killed using the very thing she had become good at. Her openness, her hard-won, generous willingness to trust other broken people. He found her in the place she had gone to heal, and he used her healing to bury her. There is one piece of this that no verdict ever closed, and it is the piece that should follow you out of the room. Diane Stewart was cremated. Whatever her body could have told us plainly, the way Helen's body eventually told its story is gone. It was turned to ash before anyone thought to ask the question. Her murder was proven by pattern, by absence, by a second crime, throwing its light backward onto the first, which means it was only ever found because he did it again to someone whose death could still be examined. And that forces a question with no comfortable answer anywhere in it. How many quiet deaths, written down as natural, sitting unremarked in the files, happened beside someone patient and calm and already trusted, and were simply never looked at a second time because there was no second victim to make anyone look? Diane was found because of Helen. Helen was found because of a joke and a neighbor and a phone that connected to the wrong network at the wrong time. Take away any one of those, and a calm man with a sick wife and a good, sad story is still out there. A widower, understanding, safe, looking across a room full of grieving people for the next one who has not yet learned that the door you open to let the kindness in is the same door everything else comes through.